What we'd like to do this afternoon is to bring you into a dialogue, if you will, about some issues that I think most of you have some acquaintance with already, because we are immersed in the technologies that are around us. But we'd like to reflect a little bit about those technologies and also the implications that they bear on ministry and discipleship and such things. For about the next 50 minutes, Clement and I will just have a conversation about some topics, questions that I have for him. And then near the end, for about the last 20 minutes or so, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions. And please submit those by Zoom chat for them to be aggregated, and then we'll try to deal with those as best that we can. I want to thank you all for joining us. But before we start in, I want to ask Glenn, since he's new to many of us and many of you, I'd like him to just say a couple words by way of introduction, especially because his background is particularly relevant to our topic of today. And before we go on, let me also say that if you wish to remain anonymous on this recorded webinar, please just blank out your screen and that will protect your privacy, or change your name in view as well. So Clement, please tell us a little about yourself.
Sure, thanks John, and thanks for inviting me to be here. It's exciting to be here at McMaster Divinity College, and I'm new here as of July. But basically, I grew up and was born. I was born and raised in the Washington D.C. area of the United States. Grew up going to a Chinese Bible church, non-denominational church there, and I came to faith at a relatively young age, and particularly my teenage years were very important for my formation. I had a really great youth pastor who really guided me through some things, and by the time my senior year came, I felt a strong call to student ministry, and went on actually to Gordon College at the time, where youth ministry, unbeknownst to me, the youth ministry program there at the time was being run by Mark Canister and Gary Parrott, and then later Bob Whitt. And it was #1 in the country for all schools that were doing youth ministry. And it was through some of the coursework there that I came across a very important name that will become important for this webinar. His name was Neil Postman, in one of my early youth ministry classes with Mark Canister. Later on, when I transferred to Wheaton College, I switched majors to communication studies. And a friend of mine at Wheaton who lived in my dorm, who was on my floor, his name was Luke, his favorite author, one of his favorite authors, was Neil Postman, and it just sort of circulated the name back into my brain. And then I really, at that point, took a much deeper dive into things, particularly because my interest in communication and communication studies had to do with some of the things that Postman was writing about. Particularly what we're going to talk today about is media ecology. And so my undergrad years, I was very interested in that type of study, and it connected pretty well with my original interest prior to my studying youth ministry. Was I went into Gordon as a computer science major. So that's sort of a little bit about my background. I ended up going into ministry after that, ended up in Taiwan for a little bit after Wheaton, where I met my wife, Tracy, and then we together went to Regent College in Vancouver, studied theology there under Ross Hastings, Julie Canlis, and did my master's thesis on Calvin and Maximus, and then ended up going into youth ministry at my home church in Maryland. They called me back. I was there for 5 years, got ordained, and then went to the University of Edinburgh, where I furthered my studies in theology with a study on Wolfhard Pannenberg and global and world Christianity. And then went to China Evangelical Seminary in Taiwan and taught there 5 years. And then here I am at McMaster, and here we are in the sense, I thought to myself that the whole media ecology thing was in my past. Prior to Neil Postman passing away, I at one point thought maybe I should go study with him at New York University. But met you, and then you were saying the coming symposium in May has to do with Christian formation and emerging technologies. And you invited me or asked me if I might be able to do an interview about that topic. And I was like, media ecology? And he said, sure, let's do it. So,
Hold you full circle back to your undergrad
Yeah.
work.
but I'm really glad you did, because as I've thought about this topic the last couple months, what I'm coming to realize as we look forward into this century and beyond, especially with all the technological advances that are continuing to move forward, is that the topic for today and for the May Symposium, which today is meant to be sort of a promotional venue for, the topic today of discipleship in the new technological era seems to me to be the pastoral and ethical applicational question moving forward. Obviously, underlying this question is the question of what it means to be a human being in a different context. The question of what it means to be a human being, what it means to be made in the image of God, and to be an image bearer of God as a human person. These questions cannot simply stay in the abstract in terms of thought and thought apart from context. The context and the culture that this question needs to, in some sense, respond to and be, and if I can use the word, embodied within, is the context that we're in and that we're heading towards. So we need to start thinking about that in a more concrete way. And I think this kind of conversation, as we mean it to be a conversation starter. Now, I mean, both of us, as we talk about this, we obviously can't fully predict what is going to happen. We can't give definitive answers, but we hope the conversation can get started and we'll have a good one.
Can we begin with just talking about what some of these technologies are? I mean, even when we met before this, and chatted informally, there were things you were bringing up that I wasn't even aware of, things that are on the radar screen and being fleshed out. So what are some of the kind of technologies that just, naming them, that we need to come back to in terms of implications for ministry?
Yeah, I mean, definitely with ministry, a lot of us, I'm sure, have already experienced, the online YouTube sermon, the Zoom chat room for our small groups, particularly during COVID, the digital media in the form of blogs and social media, exchanges, conversations, arguments that are online. And maybe we need to think about whether these kinds of things are the best way in which we are able to mediate or embody our faith. I think one of the things that we had talked about, I don't know if anyone has listened to The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, that podcast with Mike Cosper, but in episode 12, there's an interview that he does with Nick Bagardis, who used to do PR and media and then ended up being a pastor at a satellite campus for Mars Hill before he resigned, over the very question of the way that religion is being mediated, actually. He mentions in that interview that using the media ecology perspective that we are going to talk about in a little more detail in a moment, one day he walked into his satellite campus and saw a 60-foot screen at the front where the pastor isn't even there and is preaching a sermon to an audience that is set up, or to a room that's set up like a movie theater. And it was basically, in many ways, a disembodied, mediated image of a preacher preaching not to a congregation, but to an audience. And Bagardis looked back at his own upbringing in the Lutheran denomination, I forget which branch of that in the States, where the pulpit was elevated above everyone else, and there was a cross that was elevated even above that. And there was sort of a symbolic gesture through the way in which religion was mediated that talked about or spoke to the transcendence of God. So, obviously we can talk a little bit, and we should talk a little bit more about these kinds of dimensions to how faith is, in some sense, mediated. We'll need to come back to that. But
What are some, most recent, we all are sort of aware of this new AI thing that's going on, and a lot of people have, played with Chat GPT. I've not, honestly. I've been around people who have. So what, what's sort of emerging now, even in terms of nanobots and stuff that, seems crazy, but it's sort of here,
Yeah, I guess before we go on further, I should preface to everyone, all the stuff I'm gonna mention moving forward from here in this first segment, I don't even know how much of it really is gonna come to pass and how much of it is fanciful, sort of futurist imagination, but that won't actually have real application. But what we're gonna sort of mention in the next few moments are where the people who are actually working within technology and who are making futurist forecasts about where technology is going to take us, this is what they believe is going to happen. And this is where they think our society is heading. If you want a few more details about this, my friend Philip Su, he was at Microsoft for 12 years before going to Facebook for 8 years. And then he actually brought Facebook to London and started up the Facebook London office. He actually, I believe, now works for OpenAI, but he has a podcast called Peak Salvation. We get the next slide up. Those of you who might be interested in listening to this was him, and there's a little background to this, and you can notice the Amazon little symbol there. Phil, after he took on sort of an early retirement because the tech industry gave him the ability to do that, he fell into a very deep depression and he felt like he needed some way to alleviate that. And one of the ways he thought of was to maybe work at an Amazon fulfillment center during peak season. And so that's what this podcast is about. It's about his experience working in the fulfillment center at Amazon, but also seeing how technology was being applied there and then reflecting on the future of work. And in episode, I think 11, right at the bottom of the screen there, I've sort of mentioned episode 11 is called Thank You Very Much, Mr. Roboto. And it's there, he's forecasting some things about the future of work. I think this is a very soft entry into the conversation that we're having now. So if you're interested, you can go there. But the more rigorous or the more, I guess, up-to-date statement of where things are going is a book by Ray Kurzweil. That's on the next slide. It's called The Singularity is Nearer When We Merge with AI. This was actually released just in June 2024. And
who is this person?
Oh, Ray Kurzweil, I think, is one of the most respected technological futurists who's been working in AI for over 60 years. I think if you look at the endorsements on this, Bill Gates right at the front, the most trusted voice in where technology is going, et cetera. And the last book-length statement he made about where technology was and is going was 9 years ago. So this, I think, even now, June 2024, it was published, which means it wasn't finished, or the writing was probably finished at the end of 2023. And now we're, October 2024, it's already probably out of date. But in terms of probably the most up-to-date book-length statement, this is what I would maybe want to point to. But one more thing, we get that off the slide now. One more thing I think is a good resource for us. The Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence has started a project called the AI 100 Project. And they're trying to do, it's like a panel of 17 experts. And they try to give an updated statement on the status of AI every 5 years. The last two statements were 2016 and 2021. The next one's scheduled for 2026, unless they've changed that, because there have been calls for them to do it more frequently because the advances seem to be unanticipated and going faster than 5 years seems to be good for. But that's another resource that I think you can look at. But in terms of AI and stuff, I'm sure a lot of us have played with it. And yesterday, even as I was driving, my wife and I went to Burlington Mall, and on my way out, Google Maps told me to take a U-turn. And when I took the U-turn, I was pulled over by a cop who said I took an illegal U-turn. And I said, well, Google told me to do it. He said, what, are you going to just listen to Google? Well, I'm already conditioned to listen to my device, right? I was talking to Jim Payton recently. Jim is online. I think I saw him. He's our patristics professor here, and he came into my office one day very alarmed, and he said, Clement, let me tell you what happened with Google Maps. On Sunday morning, I've never put my church into Google Maps ever before. And on Sunday morning, I've got in my car, turned on my CarPlay, and Google Maps said, are you going to this church? Hit start. It knew where I was going to go. I was freaked out. The next day, I went into my car. I usually drive to McMaster Divinity College last semester on Tuesday. And then I think, or maybe last semester was Monday, but this Monday, whatever it was, McMaster Divinity College came up in the CarPlay, and he was freaked out because he'd never plugged that in either at that time either. And so these are very real experiences that a lot of us are having. And recently for me, I'm new to Canada. I needed to find car insurance, and the car insurance company that I got, they now make me put an app on my phone that is basically running all the time. They tell me to keep it on all the time. And it's monitoring how I drive. It's monitoring my speed, my cornering, which apparently I'm not very good at. I keep getting low scores for cornering.
Also, it gives you feedback.
It gives me feedback every single ride. What my score was 0 to 100 on speed, cornering, on distracted driving, on I think there's several different elements. And then the overall score at the end of the year is going to help determine my rate for next year. By simply installing the app, I get 10% off this year. My second year, I can get up to 20% off, but if I don't drive well, I might have to pay up to 5% more. And I think, my colleagues here have told me, you got to get rid of that. But I'm like, well, I don't want to waste my
Or leave your phone at home.
I don't want, I don't want to waste my above 90 score yet, And it seems like we're moving towards this sort of culture of surveillance, and that's one aspect of things. And obviously we hear rumors about, the social score in China and how we should evaluate these things. But, at the same time, technological advances in terms of AI are not necessarily all bad. Back to my friend Phil, when he went to London in 2012 to start up Facebook, he noticed that the minicab, those black minicabs, the taxi cabs that are sort of iconic for the UK, they were the dominant mode of, taxi service at the time. And Uber only had about, 40,000 drivers at the time. But just given a few years after that, the minicabs seemed to be declining, and the number of Uber drivers raised to much, much more. Well, I'm sorry. There were only a few thousand drivers in the beginning, and then by a few years later, it was like 40,000 Uber drivers. Yeah. And he would regularly just ask Uber drivers, like, why'd you switch from minicab to Uber? And the minicab drivers would say, oh, well, the dispatcher for us played favorites. The dispatcher would, based on who they liked better, give them the more profitable jobs. And based on who they didn't like, they would give them the jobs that wouldn't make very much money. And Uber takes all of that out of the picture. It's basically whichever driver is closer to whoever is calling, that's when it gets appointed, and it just seems a lot more fair. And Uber can also make suggestions based on its AI of where drivers should search in terms of a particular area, if there's an event happening or whatnot, where they can anticipate, the conditions. So in some sense too, this kind of technology can create a level of fairness for some industries that.
In fairness, if you made me think of an email I got from my daughter a couple days ago about the Habermas machine.
Right.
Taking the name from Jürgen Habermas, a social theorist, German social theorist, and this AI device computer will take input from whatever the population group is, and it will, through its algorithm, figure out what is a quote unquote fair consensus position on a social issue, for example.
Yeah.
So you have an algorithm that is determining ethics and social policy for a large group of people, and then you start worrying about who's controlling the algorithm, and it goes on, and we can.
That's scary.
That made me think about some church implications of church governance, which we can return to.
Oh, wow.
To the end of.
I would never even think about that with church governance, but that would be. But you're right. That kind of Habermas machine that's trying to give a mediating position on political views or whatnot, or what if you applied that to theology and. Let's get a mediating view between the Calvinists and the Arminians, or the dispensationalists and the covenant theologians. Yeah, that's a very interesting way to think about that. But yeah, in terms of AI and where it's going, obviously, if we think about ChatGPT 3.5 and 4, a lot of us are already feeling the effects of that in academia. Within just the last couple of years, we've all had to figure out what to do with potential plagiarism with that. And here at McMaster Divinity College, our VP academic, Jim Dvorak, he's already written a paragraph that we all need to add to our syllabi about what AI, what we need to do with AI or what students need to be aware of with AI. And even in orientation just a month ago, Jim was giving a talk about writing in the age of AI. And we wouldn't have had to do that a couple of years ago. But, a lot of this has to do with the fact that computing power is getting more powerful and it's getting faster and it's getting cheaper. And we maybe need to track back a little bit with this. When we think, for example, about the game chess. The game chess, if you were to try to create a computerized machine to play chess against you, at least the earliest renditions of it, it was a bunch of if-then statements. This whole algorithm, if-then, 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 and in this scenario do this, in this scenario do this, and the computer would have to go through all of these if-then statements to try and figure out what the next move should be, projecting, what the human person or the other player would do. And, back in the day, we would never think that a machine or a computer would be able to process all of that information so well that it could beat a human being. But in 1997, IBM's Deep Blue machine beat Garry Kasparov, who was the world reigning champion in chess at the time. And the critics at that point were saying, well, chess is still sort of a simple game. Well, take a game like Go. Go has so many more variables. You will never be able to get a machine to be able to beat the Go player, the best Go player. But sure enough, those who were more positive about that question, they were saying, well, just hold on. Computing power, algorithms, all that stuff. I think we can get a computer to beat a human player in Go in the 2020s. But then Google, in their DeepMind team, in 2016 with AlphaGo, they beat Lee Sedol, who was the second in the world at the time, 4 out of 5 games. And then a year later, 2017, they beat Ke Jie, the world reigning champion, 3 out of 3 games.
Machine learned.
The machine learned. And then that machine, the 2017 machine, it only trained for 21 days. Fast forward to more recently, they have AlphaZero. And AlphaZero trained for 4 hours simply reading the instructions of the game of chess and was able to beat every human player and every previous machine computer playing chess program from the past. The computing power is just going faster, and that kind of AI, you think that this is kind of just about games. Well, the reason that they're experimenting with games is so that they can move more towards real world application. And the real world application that they took this kind of AI simulation towards was self-driving automated cars. 2009, Google started experimenting with that, and by 2020, Google's experiment had become an independent company called Waymo, and Waymo has now basically, at the time of Kurzweil's writing about this, had already registered 20 million self-automated driven miles and has already opened up shop for self-hailing taxis in Phoenix and in San Francisco, and by now, LA and some other cities as well, I'm sure. So this is not far from reality. And, all of this sort of technological development at some point is going to displace human workers. We already see that at McDonald's. We've got the self-ordering kiosks. At supermarkets, we already have the self-checkout lanes. But when we have self-automated, self-driving cars, self-driving taxis, self-driving trucks, it's going to displace all of those drivers. That's the technological prediction. But it's also going to displace all the industries that service those drivers. The motels that are on the road, the restaurants that are on the road, the rest stops that are on the road for human drivers will all also be displaced. This is called technological unemployment or technical. Yeah. And that's supposed to be something that's in our future.
Self-serving pastoral counselor.
which
on the horizon.
Which is crazy to think about, because there's also, with this computing power rise, the prediction that the computer will actually pass a Turing test. Turing test is basic. Alan Turing was a guy who basically said, the test is whether or not we can engage with the computer and not sense that we're engaging with the computer. Like the computer's response is indistinguishable from a human being. The Turing test is projected to be only passed by 2029. A strong Turing test. And the implication of that is the Turing test is supposed to be passable by that time, which is not that many years away, in a way that the computer actually has to dumb itself down to tolerance to communicate with us. And then if you think about that, I'm not sure what our counseling professors here may think about this, but if AI is powerful enough to be able to process theories and process different scenarios, et cetera, might it be possible at that point that there is a chatbot or something that could offer professional counseling services that doesn't necessarily have a human touch, but that feels like it does? And pastoral counsel as well.
We'll circle back to pastoral implications of this, in a little bit, but let's talk about a term that, frankly, full disclosure here, was new to me.
Okay.
When we first started talking about this, a couple months ago, but media ecology.
Sure.
That's known by a lot of people, but I didn't know what it is. So help us to understand what we mean by media ecology, because as we talk about that, sets a contextual framework for processing more specifically what we are doing with technology.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we'll talk about this, and then I probably should circle back to some of the technologies too that we haven't talked about yet. Because you had mentioned nanobots earlier, we probably need to talk about that one for sure. Media ecology is a very important, I think it's still very relevant field it's an academic field, but it's a mindset. It's a sort of lens for how to interpret and discern technological change. And the term media ecology was coined by Neil Postman and Carolyn Nystrom at New York University in the early 80s, probably. They ended up having a media ecology program, like a degree program that you could do. Now it's not called that anymore. And the reason I mention all of this is because this kind of lens and mindset has, in the academy, seemed to have fallen out of vogue today. I find that to be very interesting. But I'm not fully surprised by that, because as much as I love Neil Postman and what he represented, I think I told you before, there are times I'll go to an academic conference and I'll see a paper that the title has Neil Postman in the title and Neil Postman and some kind of technology thing, and I just don't really want to go listen to the paper because I feel like the name is very cliche. The 80s are very cliche. Almost in the same way that we might think of C.S. Lewis as very important, but then C.S. Lewis, his apologetics, it's so simple or whatever, but actually he's very important. It's still very relevant. And McMaster, we're doing a conference on Lewis soon, and I think that's actually very important. But for some people who see the name C.S. Lewis or see the name Neil Postman, they may just think it's cliche, it's passe. And in communication studies, especially with the conversation about media and religion, you don't really see the names Postman and McLuhan and all these people show up as much anymore. It's not very salient. Anyway,
so what are they
doing? Yeah, what are they doing? Basically, Marshall McLuhan would probably be the person who was most important for how this sort of field came together. He had an idea called the medium is the message. The medium itself is more important. How the content of what you want to communicate, obviously, is what we usually think of as important, and the form of that, of how we communicate that, as long as the content has integrity, it's fine. But the medium is the message is basically saying no. The medium itself biases the way in which that content is received and carries with it a certain propensity towards certain perspectives and certain tendencies that we maybe have not thought about. This is why Marshall McLuhan, early on, critics of this idea called him a technological determinist in a pejorative sense. They just said, you're just a determinist about this. But Postman and Nystrom, I think the contribution that they made was that they pointed out that this kind of mindset actually is not deterministic in the way that McLuhan was accused of. And that's why they preferred the name ecology, media ecology, because they felt that that was a more proper way in which to think about this. And they were not trying to invent this field, but they were basically trying to give a name to something that they saw that could be traced all the way back to Plato and Socrates and the classics, and come all the way through to our contemporary era with thinkers like Marshall McLuhan, Lewis Mumford, and Walter Ong, et cetera. So they were trying to give a name to something that they saw in their historical understanding of the history of ideas. Okay, so let me just make 5 points about what this perspective represents and how this perspective, I think, connects. Okay, again, I'm working more on Postman here than McLuhan, but obviously McLuhan he considers McLuhan to be a teacher. There's a slide, James, I don't know, there's a slide, it's forward a little more. There's 2 books that Postman wrote. One's called Amusing Ourselves to Death in 1985, and one is called Technopoly, The Surrender of Culture to Technology, that came out in 1992. And if anyone wants to press deeper into this, these are the 2 books I recommend that you go to first. But Amusing Ourselves to Death, this idea that the medium is a message, I think is given a lot of shape and form in terms of thinking about how media shapes the way in which we receive messages. Postman makes a distinction between the literary age of exposition and the electronic age of show business, where the bias is towards impressions rather than rational. And if I were to apply that theory to now and also take into account the tracing of communication technology development from early on till now, you see here, like I'm holding a cell phone with notes in it because I'm afraid I'm going to forget stuff, as we're talking. And back before writing was invented, which we made
before the dinosaurs, it's a little generational difference here, folks.
Yeah, exactly. But before writing was invented, and this is even way before the printing press came into being, before writing was invented, there was nothing you could hold for notes. Everything was contingent upon, and knowledge was about presentation and memory. And knowledge then was carried forward by the community, not just by one person, because we would be interdependent on each other for knowledge. Well,
It was community.
it was community. Yeah, writing comes along, and we're not talking about printing press yet. We're just talking about the technology of being able to write something on a sheet of paper or a piece of parchment or whatnot. And all of a sudden, the medium for knowledge and where it's stored is on that parchment or on that sheet of paper, et cetera. And memory and community, maybe some of that begins to become undone. And then now with the printing press is when actually individualism gets birthed and objective thinking gets birthed, because of the way that knowledge is accessible that way. Anyway, there's this literary age of exposition that biases reason and objectivity, individualism, et cetera. And then the electronic age of show business, which biases just a stream of impressions that comes to you through your television. And Postman is reflecting on that. And he's reflecting on, say, politics. Politics has been completely transformed by television. That's what he was writing about in 1985. Where you have reasoned discourse prior to television. Television reduces politics to a soundbite. Howard Dean loses an election because he screams too loud. Nixon and Kennedy in 1960 in their debates. If you listened to debates on radio, you would have thought Nixon won. If you watched it on TV, you would have thought Kennedy won. Because Nixon was sweating, he didn't look as handsome, he looked a little bit disheveled. Television itself changed the reception of the message that people received. And today you had brought up the Habermas machines earlier. Just imagine politics today, and if we think about Facebook and Twitter through the lens of media ecology, then it doesn't surprise us that there is, the left-wing echo chamber and the right-wing echo chamber and 2 different Facebooks that have influenced politics. The Habermas machine is now trying to mediate between. But the ecology of the media basically makes sense why that would become a phenomenon and things would become more polarized in our day and age. Education and religion, Postman would also say, were influenced by the mediums of television and then internet later. Education becomes amusement. Religion becomes another form of entertainment. And we already mentioned the example of the 60-foot screen in the auditorium where the congregation is not on an audience, right? So the medium is message. That's idea number one. And the reason why this has impact on something we would call media ecology, the illustration that Postman then uses is he says, new technologies are not additive, they're ecological. What he means by this is, it's not like you just have whatever you had before and then you just add the printing press, like your plus printing press. No. New technologies, it's like adding a drop of red dye into a beaker of water. It influences and permeates every molecule of water. So the entire beaker becomes red. When the printing press is invented, you don't just have Europe plus printing press. You have a whole new Europe. When the automobile was invented, you don't just have America plus automobile. You have a whole different America. As a child, the television, when I was growing up, was the biggest form of media that I was attracted to. And I kept asking my parents if I could put a TV in my bedroom. And if you were to put a television in a child's bedroom in that era, you don't just have bedroom plus TV. You have a completely different bedroom. And today, you put a cell phone or a smartphone in a teenager's hand, you don't have teenager's life plus cell phone, mobile phone. You have a whole different teenage life. This is the idea of media ecology. And third idea, all technology is a Faustian bargain. It's always a blessing. It's always a curse. It always gives us something, but always takes away something. It does something, but it undoes something. So for example, the PowerPoint and the TV projector added to the classroom. Teachers now have a more convenient way of presenting information. Students have a visual means by which they can take notes. But does that undo, for example, a teacher's necessity to have rhetorical skill? Or the self-driving car, right? The self-driving car is maybe very convenient for us who have that access to that. Maybe younger children can one day just take a self-driving car without their parents needing to drive them somewhere. I don't know. The laws will be about that, stuff like that. But there's also the loss of jobs for all sorts of people in that case, right? There's a loss of this joy of being able to just sit down and drive my car, which I really like to do. So there's always this sort of Faustian bargain taking place. Even Top Gun Maverick had mentioned, they hope there'll be, computerized pilots so that pilots won't keep needing to give them attitude like Maverick was giving them. And they wouldn't need to go to the bathroom. They wouldn't need to eat. They wouldn't need to sleep. They just follow directions. The military can have something like that if AI progresses to that level. But what do we lose with that, right?
You brought up, Jim, Peyton and his experience navigating it. I like driving. I like knowing where I'm at.
Okay.
And, if I follow Siri, I haven't a clue where I'm at, and there's no context.
Right.
And so you get in a situation where, where you don't know quite what's going on, and without context, you lose orientation. And I think that's a good metaphor for what the negative of what technology can do.
Sure.
It gives us illusion of control, but it's false. It's a false sense.
Yeah. And that's also another aspect of this is I think we had mentioned this illustration. I saw a video of this little girl who was playing with a printed photograph.
I love it.
And it wouldn't enlarge or shrink based on her hand movements. So she kept complaining, Daddy, the photograph's broken. The picture is broken. Because what does this new technology give us? The technology where we can reshape things with our hands. What has that undone? That's something to think about. Now, the fourth question then, or the fourth thing that's related to the Faustian bargain would be that new technology will always have winners, it will always have losers, and it will always have some people who are unaffected. So the self-driving cars, we as consumers who need that kind of service, we win. The drivers who need that for employment lose. But the person who lives in New York City who never needs to drive anywhere, they're not affected. Or the mini cab example of Uber. The Uber drivers won, the mini cab companies lost. People who aren't in that industry, they're unaffected. Postman gives the example of the printing press. The Catholics lost, the Protestants won, and the Jewish people, which Postman was Jewish, who are unaffected. So there's winners, losers, and there's some who are unaffected. And then finally, there is a tendency for new technologies after they've sort of settled into the public consciousness to become mythical. What does that mean? It means that we go about our days not aware anymore that there used to be a time where that technology was not part of our reality and that these technologies were actually inventions. And if we were to think about some things that maybe today we don't think of as technologies, mathematical symbols in that day and age was a technology. The alphabet is a technology. Our language can be seen as a technology. These things are now at mythical status. We don't realize that these were human inventions. Or another invention, I'm looking at it right now, the clock.
I was gonna ask you about that with the monks, how.
Yeah.
That's a good illustration of how it has changed, not just.
We don't think about the fact that time and the way that we count time and that the clock is actually not part of the natural order of things. It was a human invention. It was invented in the 12th, 13th century. The first mechanical clock was invented by the Benedictine monks. And they were inventing this thing so that they could regulate their 7 times of needing to do prayer every day. And little did they know that by the middle of the 14th century, it would go outside the walls of the monastery and into the world and basically be able to regulate when people were working and when people weren't working, and basically become the underpinning for the Industrial Revolution as well as our capitalist modern economic order. You know, they had no idea the consequences of that. And we, looking back, we often forget that the clock is not part of the natural order of things. You know, and so there's a danger when that happens. But that's a really interesting illustration of the clock, because these new technologies that we have been talking about, which we haven't finished overviewing, we have no idea what consequences they will bring to culture and society. We can't even anticipate, in the same way that the monks could not anticipate what the clock was going to do to the world. I can't even begin to anticipate if that nanobot idea goes off the ground.
So you're chomping at the bit, Clement. Go ahead. Share with us, I'm eager to hear.
Well, let's go back here. Jacques Ellul, 1964, wrote a book called The Technological Society. And this is also part of Postman's sourcing. He's a big Ellul fan. Ellul talks about technological society and how everything gets reduced to efficiency, but there's also something he speaks of called the technological imperative, which means technology, for those of us who live in this technological world, there's only one direction that development can go, and that's up. And I bring this back to my friend Phil Su again, when he first got to Facebook from Microsoft. Phil tells me, because back then, you know, when Facebook was relatively new and early and I was still on there with a profile, I would log in from time to time and I would be really annoyed with a new feature that was installed that they were making me change the appearance of my profile or whatnot. And I remember sitting down at dinner with Phil when he told me that he'd started working for Facebook. I said, why do you guys do that? Why do you keep changing things? I like it the way it is. And he said, we can't not change it. We can't not develop it. That's just the way the technology works. And then he said his first week at Facebook, there's a rite of passage that every single person who works for Facebook has to pass, according to Phil. Is in the first week that you're at Facebook, you go to this little corner called boot camp in the building. And by the end of the week, you have to introduce a new feature or a bug fix as a rite of passage to keep staying on as employee. So his first week there, he developed the feature of being able to tag photos with your phone. And overnight, one day after release of that, 74 million people have used it. It was a very, very surreal experience for him to realize that something he made and developed was being used by so many people around the world in such a short amount of time. But that entire mindset of things need to continue to go forward, that's why the technologists and the futurists and the predictions that they're giving us, we can't really completely ignore them, because these things really may come to pass.
They're gonna carry us on.
Yeah, they may carry us on.
That's the environment.
And this is where we maybe need to pick up here. We used to think, right? We watched the Jetsons and we used to think that what AI was going to be able to help us do was to clean our house and cook our food and do our chores. We had Rosie from the Jetsons, the mechanical robot, in our minds, and maybe the self-driving car or the self-driving plane that was in our head as well. But we never thought for a moment that actually what was going to come first was not cleaning and cooking, because robots still lack the dexterity to do that. We never thought that they were going to be coming after, say, the computer programmer's jobs, where you need a 4-year college degree. But, just a couple of years ago, I think 2022, AlphaCode by Google, there was an online competition with computer programmers that beat 54% of the programmers who were human. And AI is coming after the computer programmer's job. And we would never think that AI was going to come after the creative jobs, the art and graphic designer jobs, the photography jobs. Just the other day, James, if we could get these next 2 slides up. I popped in, this is ChatGPT 4 with Dolly. I popped in this little prompt about Luther being on the International Space Station, and this is what ChatGPT gave me within seconds, And I refined it a little bit because I wanted a fatter version of Luther drinking coffee on the International Space Station with a Gothic style. ChatGPT can do that for me, and it does it for me in a way that some graphic designers or human beings can't do that. I can't do that. The next is I wanted a hyper realistic photo of a 5-year-old girl holding a sunflower, and it gave me an image that was a little too professional. So I said, hey, scale it back, give it to me in a point and shoot mode rather than SLR. And this is what it gave me. That little girl doesn't exist in real life, but it looks really real. And I think the technology is only going to get better. We never thought that that was where AI was going to take us. We never thought for a minute that was where it was going to take us. But, language translation of books, that job's probably going to be gone at some point. They're now going to use 3D printers to print things, to build houses with. Print a pipe for me. That pipe is going in my house. We never thought about that. We talk maybe an area we don't think about much. There's this whole sector in the market called Love AI. There are chatbots that are both disembodied and embodied, who can be a virtual girlfriend. Maybe there's virtual boyfriends out there as well, who can give someone the love and affirmation and loyalty and sexual availability that someone wants without needing to go through all the contentiousness of having an actual relationship with another human being. How is that going to change,
Well, we're getting into the relational component of image, being image of God, and now it's getting, very real in terms of pastoral implications for how we do church together. And what people come to expect in terms of relationship and what they're conditioned to seeking.
Exactly.
Such. Maybe we need to chat for a few minutes about that question of the image of God, and the question of, technically theological anthropology. Fancy word that we use, because it underpins everywhere that we go. Everything we need to address at a practical level has to go through that filter.
Absolutely.
In a sense, we talk about that. So, image of God.
Image of God.
So this is theological anthropology for a minute.
Yeah.
What's a shift? We talked about the substantial versus functional. Educate us a bit on the shift that's happened in.
This back in the day, I think the substantial or substantive view of the image of God was the most popular.
We have all psychological capacities,
Yes,
such that is what it means.
the image of God meant our rationality, our volition. But the problem was, well, what about someone who, an infant? They don't have that capacity. What about someone who's mentally disabled, who maybe doesn't have the fullness of that capacity? Does that mean they are less of the image of God than I am, as someone who has that capacity, right? So there were inherent problems with that type of view. And the other two, I guess, competing views that I don't necessarily think we should put them in competition, but they sometimes are placed in competition, would be the functional view based on Genesis 1:26-27. Let's create human beings in our own image, male and female, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air. And there's this sort of cultural imperative or the cultural calling or commission For us to basically be stewards of God's creation, stewards of God's earth. The Eastern Orthodox use the phrase priests of creation. And I think that that is built into what it means for us to represent God's reign on earth as the image of God. And then there's a third view called the relational view, which is basically the image of God is relational and is based on how our relationship with God is. There's a dynamic quality to it in the sense that if our relationship with God is more straight, if I can put it that way, or more untwisted, then we more and more bear the image. And if the more twisted it is, you're not out of the image of God, but you're just not bearing it in as perfect or as wholesome of a way. And these three views sometimes compete with each other. But I think both of us are of the mindset that they actually are complementary to each other.
Yeah, we talked about that.
Yeah.
Especially the functional rule and the relational are clearly there. There's one that my colleagues in the Old Testament Guild like to talk about a lot, and I think we're more in tune to it because we think about ancient areas from context and what an image meant.
Right.
You know, the very word itself that's used in the text necessarily implicates a notion of embodiment.
Mm.
Now, in ancient areas, images of deities might be anthropomorphic. They might look like a man or a woman, but not necessarily, and not always. It might be, just a standing stone that's 3 to 6 feet high. It might be an obelisk. I
Right.
think Nebuchadnezzar's image in Daniel 4 was probably an obelisk, judging from the dimensions of the text
Right.
gives us, and we have examples of those from the ancient Near East. And so when, when Genesis says that we are created as the image of God, that word means we are physical representations
Mm.
of what, what it means to be, an image. That has huge implications for what happens when technology starts to shape and mold our environment, ecology.
Right.
And what does it mean to remain being a true human being in the midst of all that? So we are, we are physical, and that plays in. We had this conversation a little bit, so let's bring it out because it's one important application. Transhumanism, the idea that we transcend just kind of this bodily existence, technology as savior.
Mhm.
Unpack that for us for
Yeah.
a minute.
If we were to bring, James, if we bring up that slide of the 5 questions about media ecology to help us discern the era. There's a slide there. But I think if we were to look at the futurist view of the world, what they're basically trying to say is technology is our savior, and that technological progress is human progress. These questions on the screen right now, these are the media ecology questions that can give us a discernment framework for evaluating some of the different new technologies that are coming out or that we already have with us. And you can kind of look at that while I'm talking here. But you mentioned transhumanism. I also think as we're thinking about what the message is of these new technological mediums, technological progress is human progress, technology is our savior.
That's what we're being told.
And so we're sort of, being told by osmosis and also explicitly. But there's also a sense in which if we think about what is the natural heresy of the technological society, I can't help but think that the natural heresy of it is Gnosticism. This idea that soul and mind over body and body doesn't matter. The transhumanist example you gave a second ago, I'll touch on that in a second, but maybe we can jump back for a moment to this physical thing that you were talking about, because you can take the slide off now, James. The science that we're talking about healthcare moving forward, I think we mentioned in conversation before, when COVID hit, our computers are now powerful enough to basically sequence things very quickly. Moderna was able to sequence their vaccine within like 2 days and get a vaccine to market in 63 days. using AI and computers. And the technological imperative of how this is going to continue to go. James, one more slide is the computing power slide, because I want people to be able to see just how powerful computers are becoming in just such a short amount of time. You can look at those stats for yourself. Okay, and now we're in 2024, and that's only going to continue to be advancing. Computer power by second by cost. Okay, but we talk about this, and the vision of the technologists at this point is to use nanotechnology to create nanobots. A nano is basically 0.5 to 3 micron, to 5 microns, very, very small thing. These nanobots that can be uninvasively inserted into our body, into our bloodstream, clear out clogged arteries, can monitor things because it's a computer, right? It's an AI kind of thing. Help us monitor our health conditions. If they see something building up that one day could cause a stroke 10 years down the line, they can already catch that and give me feedback about that in my app. But the ultimate vision is that they will also be able to send nanobots into the brain and have the attachment of these things to our neocortices in a way that attaches our brain to the cloud. And then they can continually upgrade this by sending another layer of nanobots whenever they need to. And the ultimate vision also is that these nanobots will be self-replicating. Now, all this sounds very fanciful and very scary, and I don't know how much of this is science fiction. I'm just telling you what Ray Kurzweil is saying and what some of these technology companies are moving towards.
So we're working on that.
So then what does that mean for the physicality of the image of God? That brings up some really interesting questions. And then the other picture of this is through this type of technology, will it one day be possible to upload our consciousness to the cloud in a way that we can, in some sense, live forever? Would that consciousness truly be us? Or will that consciousness be an emulation of us? But, with these nanobots on our brain, Ray Kurzweil projects that there will be a day where 99.9% of our brain is not human. So if we go with a substantial view of the image of God, does that mean that we are no longer the image? Or does that mean that there's something happening there? That theologically, what does that mean? And this is where I'm not sure how to think about this, because I do think form is very important, substance is very important, but I've never been able to understand or explain it. I've always left that to mystery, because the standard explanations of rationality or volition have never fully captured the idea of image for me in the substantive sense. The functional relational views, I think, are more compelling in terms of, by relationship with God, we are in the image of God to the extent that our relationship with God has a certain kind of perfection to it. And the more twisted that relationship is, we are still in the image of God, but we're representing God in a twisted way. The more untwisted that relationship is, the more we're able to function as representatives of God's reign here on earth, and the more that mysterious substance of whatever it means for form of image really is displayed. But if it's the case that the substantive is left in mystery and we got nanobots in our brain, I don't necessarily think that compromises the image. So it brings up questions about it for sure, because functional and relational are still there. But then the function of basically being tasked with the cultural mandate to care for all of creation, if technology becomes sovereign over us, then I think we have failed to do what we're called to do as function. And so somehow, and I think the husband says this, we have to find a way to maintain our sovereignty over technology. That's part of what it's going to mean to be in the image of God moving forward.
We capitulated the image as soon as we are no longer over the technology, but controlled by it or under.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So we just have a couple minutes here before we turn it over to some questions. And I want us to just touch, I jotted down some thoughts that I have. And maybe that's all it's going to be at this point, is thoughts for stimulating conversation.
Conversation starter.
That's what this is about, to get people in our audience here who are ministry practitioners, issues to be thinking about. For example, to what extent, we already mentioned the question of counseling.
Yeah.
How do we employ at some point artificial intelligence as an office assistant to take away some of our pastoral burdens that are on us? What about using Chat GPT to construct sermons? If you have any initial, just
Can the Holy Spirit fill ChatGPT?
well, yeah.
Possibly, can be a tool for us to use, but basically too, what is the message of ChatGPT? How does that medium, what does that do and undo, right? In terms of the preaching past. Maybe it can be a tool to stir up some of our imagination as a human preacher. But if it's a wholesale use of ChatGPT to preach a sermon, at this point, ChatGPT's sermons are not very good.
At some point though, someone can, you digitally, it's the electronic church and you say, what do I want to hear a sermon on today?
Mm,
You don't need the preacher, you just ask the AI device
yeah,
to put together a message that's edifying on what scratches you where you itch.
that's true.
So when we talk about the ecology, the environment, in theory, we don't know where this is going to go, but let's replace the pastor. I don't need a pastor to counsel me. I don't need a pastor to preach to me anymore, because we become so conditioned in our individualism and what we expect as consumers,
Right.
that we don't even think about the relational component of the image of God anymore.
That's
and
true.
how God uses that.
And if the technologists are right and there's nanobots in my brain and I no longer need a keyboard anymore to even input my thoughts, but can just think abstractly and images will just show up in my mind. We don't even need the screen anymore. I could imagine a preacher just preaching me what I want to hear.
Yeah.
But there is this sense in which God has called human pastors and preachers to carry on his work in representation of him. And again, we need to uphold that somehow.
The kingdom is it is populated by embodied
Yes,
image bearers.
absolutely, because the natural heresy of technological society is Gnosticism. And when it comes to discipleship, anything that we can do to bring things closer to incarnational is probably what we need to be doing. Yeah, even in the Zoom post-COVID situation.
So back to the Habermas machine.
Yeah.
We could let AI solve our theological debates.
Yep.
We could, when I was pastoring, we had what we call the timely consensus model. And the leaders of the church would sit down on a decision we had to make if we felt really stuck and it was really important. And we would eat individually, we'd go around the table and we had to weigh in on a scale of +3 to -3, where we were on this question. +3 means if we don't do this, I'm out of here. -3 means if we do this, I'm out of here. And then, you can work towards zeros. I don't care. Well, it didn't make a decision for us, but it forced us into a process whereby we prayerfully, seeking scripture and, and letting the Holy Spirit as a community shape our decision-making as a group of leaders.
Right.
But we can just turn it over to AI and it can make the decision for us. And so with regard to the church governance, or with regard to our theological differences, we've missed a process that I think the Holy Spirit would use.
Yeah.
As hard and painful and nasty as it sometimes gets, it's the means by which Jesus has chosen through his Spirit to shape the church and us as individuals as well.
Absolutely.
So these are just some thoughts. And then a whole area that we haven't even touched on, but we will in our symposium in May, is genetic issues,
Yeah.
family planning, the way technology is utterly revolutionizing medicine and the way we think about ourselves as human beings.
For sure.
But we need to turn over. So
We do.
a couple of questions here.
Thanks everyone for listening.
Yeah.
How do we do the questions?
Yeah, they send in through chat, the chat feature on Zoom, and James will help us to filter.
You want to read them?
Yeah, we could do that. Like, could read them off to us. Cheers. Okay. Where do I start here? Kelvin Mutter. Thanks for the shout out of the practice of discipleship, pastoral care. Kelvin, for those of you who don't know, is a professor here of pastoral counseling in our new MA program, counseling. It is an inescapable reality that the time will come, if it hasn't already, that a computer will replicate some aspects of the therapeutic or counseling encounter. I wonder about Dr. Wynn's thoughts about technology's limitations for possible strengths to provide embodied connection. So we have like 1 minute to answer that.
Kelvin, you and me both know you know way more about what that.
You'll be our next guest.
Yeah, because I really don't know to what extent this is going to be emulatable, human touch, etc.
Yeah.
But I'm sure someone is thinking about it, and if someone's thinking about it, it's probably going to get worked on. But can that truly replace a human person counseling? I hope not. I hope not, because I think there's still something about being created in the image of God that is the unique contribution that technology will never be able to replace. I'm sure Kelvin, man, I think you have way more to say about this than I do.
But we would expect it though, because ministry is incarnational.
Yeah.
We would expect that somehow, circumventing that or doing an end run around, the ability to touch,
Right.
or at least in theory, because there are boundaries in counseling, but a human face to face is important. And it reminded me of what, my wife shared with me the other day about a work situation she just heard where they hired a young woman in a job capacity who wouldn't answer the phone, not saying wouldn't answer the phone because we think she doesn't know how to deal with that. And then she views also that, if you're going for a job interview, if you can just keep eye contact throughout the interview, you got the job, because technology through, social media, through our messaging and everything, we're losing the capacity as human beings to interact with each other at a human level. It's very tangibly already showing up in a lot of places. But anyway, Kelvin,
Sadly, that sounds
as
like
Clement knows, you know a lot more about this than I do.
it sounds like the human skill thing is going to be part of discipleship moving forward. To teach people to do that.
Aaron,
Yeah.
regarding the concept of medium as the message, the first question that comes to mind is, how can we and our young congregation remain holy while being surrounded by the harmful message prevalent in today's media? I find that social media, at least contents created by the majority of the young Korean generation, is saturated with stories and messages that promote certain dominant ideologies, often prioritizing visual appeal or instant gratification. But what about that aspect of the college that we are having? Content is edifying or harmful. What do we do about that?
Yeah, this brings us to a very important thing that we're called to do in every era, and that is to have a certain narrative fidelity to the Christian gospel. Kelvin actually was really helpful to me earlier in the week. He basically said that sometimes when he's talking with students about certain theories, etc., he'll ask the student and say, what's the world's logic on this? And then what's the gospel logic on this? But as the church in the world, we are in some sense, I think Stanley Hauerwas was right. Will Willimon was right. We're called in some sense in times where the cultural ethos and the Christian ethos do not match. We're called to live in community in a way that embodies the counter narrative of the gospel in an incarnational way. We live from an alternate story. And the alternate story that we're living, we have to find a way for that story to really take hold in the imagination of those who are in our churches. How do we do that? Well, if you're going to use the same media to do that as the mediums that are used to promote all the stuff that you're talking about, Aaron is talking about, then it's basically, I don't know if that necessarily is the best way forward, because you're going to be competing on the same kinds of grounds, but the medium is the message and the medium is going to win. So then how do you do it in a different way? And when Paul speaks of the foolishness of preaching, is there a sense in which we have to turn an eye away from all of these temptations of the contemporary mediums that are available to us and return to the foolishness of what Scripture gives us? Foolishness to the world, right? Yeah, but the counter narrative and living with narrative fidelity and reinvesting our symbols with power and meaning. When Nick Wagardis was talking about the 60-foot screen at the front of the auditorium with no crosses and no pulpit, no elevation, nothing. Basically, the symbolic universe and narrative is different there than if we were to reinvest our symbols, the cross and the bread and the wine, Scripture, etc., with meaning that is really grasped in a way that orients a young person's view of the entire world. Lee Palmer Wandel is a historian who works with the Reformation period. She writes about how when the Reformation was first sort of coming into being, Christianity was not a doctrine. Christianity was not a set of propositions or beliefs. I mean, this is pre-printing press, right? Christianity was a whole world. It was like this, it was like an enchanted world that people just lived in.
Yeah.
And moving forward in the technological society, I think that's what we have to find a way to recapture in some ways.
Yeah, I like that. I talked about enchantment a little bit before, and it's a whole area I wish we could chat more about, but enchantment captures my imagination in a way that the word supernatural doesn't. Supernatural, that's a theological term I throw around, but enchantment, it engages me to think about what it really means in terms of my whole person response to what's around me. I like that phrase, that term used. Let me read another one here that Ted, everyone. Wow, so everyone's seen this already. It's really a question. Okay, let's see. What if, Anson Ant to everyone, what if one day AI and robots can largely eliminate work in our human lives and solve the energy problem like in Star Trek way? I guess you have replicators and they've got, fusion devices. How do you think it would impact us as image bearers who are supposed to tend the garden and have dominion on earth?
Exactly.
Great question.
Exactly. That's the problem. Well, from the world's side of things, my friend Philip Sue's podcast, go listen to it, because he thinks that is the future of work. Everyone's going to be technically unemployed. And then also, we're going to need some kind of universal basic income. But everything's going to be a lot cheaper. Ray Kurzweil will say, with all the machines doing all the labor and stuff, everything becomes cheaper. Like an ebook, it can be cheaper than a print book, etc. Now, from the spiritual side of things, that's why the question of what it means to be a human being becomes the most important question that we have to revisit. Is because when people don't have this function of needing to tend to the garden, and we don't have a strong sense of vocation anymore, and I hope that doesn't happen. Hanson, hi, by the way, it's been a long time we haven't seen each other. I hope that doesn't happen, but it's going to bring up the question of what does it mean to be a human being? And it's going to create, hopefully, a lot of conversation, not only within theology, but also with the philosophers, the dialogue between the two of what that means. And that's going to end up being one of the great pursuits in a world like that. We don't have this tending the garden thing to have to do anymore. What does it mean for me to be human? And I hope we never get to that.
So let me you underscore the theological anthropology seems to be at the center of this, but this is my the closing question. We won't be able to answer it. But Errol, ask the question, what are the theological implications apart from the image of God ethos? I mean, let's not answer it, we don't have time, but what does this do to our view of who God is and the nature of God? You know, we could launch this into lots of other areas of theology that Arrow reminds us of as well. So,
What does it mean to be saved?
Yeah, what does it mean to say? Talk about that with transhumanism.
Mm-hmm.
We gotta come to a close here. Fortunately, this is the beginning of a conversation. I want to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. And I think we have one final slide, James, about the coming symposium on May 8th. Mark your calendars, look for more information, Christian formation and emerging technologies that we will devote a whole day to in the months ahead in the spring. So thank you all. And Clement, thank you so much for sharing with us. This has been a good conversation that we get to continue. So thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.